The trick was never about hiding. It was about being seen in the wrong places at the right times, about creating so many versions of yourself that prosecutors could never assemble a single coherent picture to present to a jury. Lucky Luciano understood something that every other mob boss of his generation missed. In America, the man who controls the paperwork controls reality itself, and the man who leaves no paperwork controls nothing and everything simultaneously. On the night of April 10th, 1931, while Dutch Schultz raged through the streets of Manhattan looking for the Irish gunman who had clipped two of his runners, and while Joe Masseria sat in a Coney Island restaurant believing he was about to negotiate the future of the Italian underworld, Luciano was doing what he did best. He was nowhere and everywhere, his name attached to nothing, his presence felt in 6 different boroughs through 6 different men who would swear under oath that they had never met him. Charles Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in the sulfur-choked village of Lercara Fridi, Sicily, in 1897, a place where the rules were simple and brutal. You paid the men with guns, or you became an example. His father was a laborer in the sulfur mines, bent and broken by the time he was 40, and the boy learned early that there were 2 kinds of men in the world: those who worked themselves to death and those who made others work for them. When the family came to America in 1906, they settled in the Lower East Side, where the streets smelled like rotten fish and coal smoke, where children fought over bread crusts, and where the Irish gangs controlled everything from the docks to the police precincts. Young Salvatore, who would soon start calling himself Charlie, learned his first American lesson in an alley behind a tenement on 14th Street. The Irish cops who beat him bloody for selling hats without a license were not interested in justice. They were interested in their cut. But Luciano's genius was not in recognizing corruption. Every street kid in Manhattan understood that cops could be bought. What Luciano recognized was that corruption was a system, not a transaction. It had rules, hierarchies, weak points. The Irish cop who took a bribe on Monday would arrest you on Tuesday if his sergeant needed numbers. The Tammany Hall politician who promised protection would sacrifice you the moment the newspapers started asking questions. The old mustache Petes from Sicily, men like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, believed that power came from fear and that loyalty was purchased through blood oaths and theatrical displays of violence. They were generals fighting a 19th century war in a 20th century city, and Luciano understood they were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The trick Luciano developed was deceptively simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. Compartmentalization as an art form. He didn't just separate his illegal activities from his legitimate ones. He separated himself from his own organization so completely that even the men who worked for him couldn't testify to what he actually did. In the early days, when he was still running with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, hijacking liquor trucks and shaking down speakeasies, Luciano never touched the merchandise. He never drove the trucks. He never collected the money. He was the man who arranged the meeting, who nodded when deals were proposed, who disappeared before signatures were required. Witnesses could place him in rooms, but they couldn't place him in crimes. He was the ghost at every table, the voice that made suggestions, but never gave orders. When Prohibition turned half of America into criminals, Luciano saw the opportunity that the old-timers missed. The Mustache Petes wanted to control the liquor trade the way they controlled Italian neighborhoods in Brooklyn and the Bronx, through violence and intimidation, through a hierarchical structure where every soldier answered to a capo, who answered to an underboss, who answered to the boss. It was a system designed for the old country, where everyone knew everyone, where family ties meant something, where betrayal was rare because everyone understood the consequences. But in the chaos of 1920s America, where fortunes were being made overnight and alliances shifted with every new shipment of Canadian whiskey. The old system was a liability. If the boss got arrested, the whole organization collapsed. If a soldier got picked up by the cops, he could give up the entire chain of command. The Mustache Pete's were building pyramids in an earthquake zone. Luciano built a web instead. He created what would later be called the Commission, but in those early years, it had no name because it barely existed on paper or in conversation. It was an understanding among men who saw the future. Meyer Lansky, with his financial genius, Bugsy Siegel, with his West Coast ambitions, Frank Costello, with his political connections, Joe Adonis, with his legitimate business fronts. These were not subordinates. They were partners, each running their own operations, each insulated from the others, each providing a service that made the whole network stronger without making it dependent on any single person. When prosecutors went after one part of the organization, the rest continued functioning. When one partner was imprisoned, the others stepped in to manage his interests until his release. The structure was so diffuse, so deliberately vague, that law enforcement couldn't even agree on what to call it. The newspapers called it the syndicate. The FBI called it organized crime. The men inside it called it nothing at all. The real genius of Luciano's system was in the communication protocols. In the old days, mob bosses held court in social clubs, sat at the head of tables in Italian restaurants, conducted business where everyone could see them being bosses. Luciano never had an office. He had a dozen apartments scattered across Manhattan, each leased under a different name, each furnished identically so that associates would never know which one they were in. He never scheduled meetings. He suggested possibilities. An associate might receive a phone call from a payphone, a brief message delivered in code that sounded like a conversation about horse racing or restaurant recommendations. The venue was always public, always crowded. The lobby of the Waldorf Astoria, a busy barbershop in Midtown, a boxing match at Madison Square Garden. These were places where being seen meant nothing, where a handshake could be a greeting or a transfer of folded bills, where a quiet conversation was lost in the ambient noise of 100 other conversations. Luciano also understood that the police were not the real threat. The police could be bribed, intimidated, or simply outmaneuvered. The real threat was the federal government, particularly the young prosecutors coming out of elite law schools, men like Thomas Dewey, who saw mob prosecutions as stepping stones to political careers. These men couldn't be bought because they were already rich. They couldn't be intimidated because they had the full power of the government behind them. They were true believers in the system, and they were dangerous precisely because they were incorruptible. Luciano's solution was characteristically indirect. He made himself simultaneously too valuable to ignore and too complicated to prosecute. The key was Operation Underworld, though that name would not be attached to it until years later. When the Second World War came to America and German U-boats started sinking cargo ships within sight of the East Coast, the United States Navy found itself with a problem. The docks were controlled by the mob, and the longshoremen's unions were notoriously difficult to penetrate. Naval intelligence needed information about sabotage, about which workers might be German sympathizers, about suspicious activity in the shipyards. They needed it fast, and they needed it to be reliable. The official story is that Navy officers approached Meyer Lansky, who arranged a meeting with Luciano through intermediaries. The unofficial story, whispered in certain circles but never proven, is that Luciano arranged the entire thing himself, using intermediaries to suggest to naval intelligence that the mob could be helpful, that certain channels could be open, that patriotism and self-interest sometimes aligned. The beauty of the operation was that it required nothing illegal from Luciano. He was in prison at the time, convicted on compulsory prostitution charges in a trial that he always insisted was a frame job orchestrated by Dewey. From his cell at Great Meadow Correctional Facility, he simply passed along messages. He suggested names. He vouched for certain individuals. When the Navy needed dock workers questioned, the questioning happened. When they needed labor disputes resolved quickly so that ships could be loaded on schedule, the disputes vanished. No acts of sabotage occurred on the New York docks during the war. And while it's impossible to say how much of that was due to mob cooperation versus simple good fortune, the Navy believed it was worth something. After the war, Luciano's sentence was commuted and he was deported to Italy. The official reason was his wartime cooperation. The unofficial reason was that he had made himself too useful to punish fully and too dangerous to release in America. But even before the war, Luciano's most sophisticated trick was his handling of witnesses and evidence. In the Masseria hit, the one that started the Castellamarese War's endgame, Luciano had been dining with Joe the Boss at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro when gunmen burst in and shot Masseria 6 times. Luciano, according to his own testimony, had been in the bathroom when the shooting occurred. It was the perfect alibi. Plausible, impossible to disprove, and subtly insulting to prosecutors who had to explain to a jury that the great Lucky Luciano just happened to be powdering his nose when his boss was murdered. The gunmen were never identified. The restaurant owner claimed to have seen nothing. The other diners had convenient amnesia. And Luciano walked free, because being in the vicinity of a crime is not the same as committing it. He applied this principle to every aspect of his operations. Money never touched his hands directly. Associates would make deposits into legitimate bank accounts belonging to shell corporations with layers of ownership that would take federal investigators months to untangle. By the time they traced the money back to anything connected to Luciano, the statute of limitations had often expired, or the paper trail had gone cold, or the key witness had moved to Chicago or Miami, or simply disappeared. Luciano's legitimate businesses, dress factories, import companies, restaurants, were structured so that he appeared to be an investor rather than an operator. His name on paperwork only when absolutely necessary. His involvement always filtered through attorneys and accountants who had plausible deniability built into every transaction. The prostitution conviction that finally brought him down in 1936 was the exception that proved the rule. Thomas Dewey, desperate to make a case that would stick, went after the weakest link in Luciano's armor, his bookers and madams, the women who ran the brothels, and the men who collected the money. Dewey offered them deals. Testify against Luciano, or face decades in prison yourselves. Some of them took the deal. Some of them lied on the stand, saying whatever Dewey wanted them to say, because they understood that the prosecutor's office cared more about convicting Luciano than about the truth. The trial was a spectacle. Witnesses describing meetings that may or may not have occurred, money changing hands in apartments that may or may not have existed, a vast prostitution network that Luciano allegedly controlled from a distance. The jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years. But even in prison, Luciano remained untouchable in the ways that mattered. His organization continued operating. His partners continued making money. His reputation, if anything, grew stronger because he had been brought down only through what many in the underworld considered fabricated testimony from desperate witnesses. The psychological warfare Luciano waged was equally sophisticated. He cultivated an image of himself as the modernizer, the man who brought business sense to the underworld, who ended the violent feuds of the Castellamarese War not through superior firepower, but through superior organization. He encouraged journalists to write about the commission as if it were a corporate board, to describe mob activities in the language of business rather than criminality. This served 2 purposes. It made his operations seem less threatening to the public, and it made prosecutors seem like they were persecuting an entrepreneur rather than a criminal. When he gave interviews, which was rarely, he spoke in measured tones about legitimate business interests, about misunderstandings and false accusations, about how a boy from Sicily had tried to make something of himself in America and had been persecuted for his success. But beneath the civilized veneer, Luciano was perfectly willing to use violence when necessary. He just made sure it was untraceable. The myth about him is that he was less violent than the old mustache Pete's, but this is a misunderstanding of his methods. He was just more efficient. When Maranzano was killed in his office in 1931, officially by gunmen posing as federal agents, the hit was clean, professional, and completely disconnected from Luciano in any evidentiary sense. When witnesses needed to be silenced, they didn't disappear dramatically. They simply had accidents, moved to other cities, or decided that cooperating with prosecutors was unhealthy. The violence was surgical, targeted, and always carried out by men who had no direct connection to Luciano himself. His deportation to Italy in 1946 should have been the end of his story. But Luciano understood that exile was just another form of distance, and distance was his specialty. From his villa in Naples, he maintained contact with American operations through encrypted communication, through trusted intermediaries, through coded messages hidden in legitimate business correspondence. He invested in casinos in Havana, working with Meyer Lansky to turn Cuba into the mob's Caribbean playground. He dabbled in narcotics trafficking, though he always claimed to oppose drugs personally, a stance that was either principled or pragmatic, depending on who you asked. He gave interviews to journalists, carefully curating his legend, presenting himself as an old man who had been unfairly persecuted, who just wanted to live out his days in peace. The truth was more complicated. Luciano never stopped being Luciano. He never stopped calculating angles, looking for leverage, building networks. In the 1950s, when the Kefauver committee hearings dragged mob figures before television cameras and exposed the extent of organized crime to the American public, Luciano was safely in Italy, beyond the reach of subpoenas, watching his former associates squirm under questioning. Some of them invoked the Fifth Amendment. Some of them claimed to be legitimate businessmen. Some of them played dumb, pretending not to understand questions about gambling operations and labor racketeering. Luciano, watching from across the ocean, must have felt a certain satisfaction. They were using his techniques: denial, misdirection, plausible deniability, even if they lacked his finesse. The final years of his life had a melancholy quality that would have seemed impossible in the violent days of the Castellammarese War. He lived in a comfortable apartment in Naples, took walks along the waterfront, met with Italian producers who wanted to make movies about his life. He gave interviews in which he portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, who had been convicted on false testimony from unreliable witnesses. He never admitted to anything significant. He never expressed remorse. In January 1962, he died of a heart attack at Naples Airport, reportedly on his way to meet with a Hollywood producer about a biopic. His body was returned to New York and buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, a final irony for a man who had been exiled from the city that made him. But the real legacy of Lucky Luciano was not his death. It was the system he created, the organizational model that survived him. The commission still exists in various forms, though it's been weakened by RICO prosecutions and electronic surveillance. The principle of compartmentalization, of insulating the leadership from the street-level crimes, is now standard practice in every major criminal organization. The use of legitimate businesses as fronts, the careful management of public image, the strategic deployment of violence rather than its casual application, these were all innovations that Luciano either invented or perfected. Modern organized crime is built on the foundation he laid, even if most of the current players don't know his name. The secret trick, if it can be reduced to a single principle, was this: Luciano understood that the American legal system was not designed to prosecute ghosts. It was designed to prosecute men who gave orders, who signed documents, who could be placed at crime scenes through witness testimony and physical evidence. By making himself into a ghost, present but never provably so, influential but never documentably so, he created a prosecution problem that even the best investigators struggled to solve. He was the man who was always in the room but never in the photograph. Always part of the conversation but never on the recording. Always benefiting from the crime but never committing it himself. Prosecutors eventually figured out how to combat this strategy. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, made it possible to prosecute entire criminal enterprises rather than individual crimes, to prove patterns of racketeering rather than specific acts. Modern surveillance technology, wiretaps, hidden cameras, electronic monitoring, made it much harder to communicate secretly. The era of the untouchable mob boss, the man who could orchestrate crimes from a safe distance while maintaining plausible deniability, largely ended in the 80s and 90s when bosses like John Gotti and Paul Castellano found themselves convicted based on recordings of their own voices discussing criminal activities. The ghost trick only worked when ghosts couldn't be recorded. But in his time, Luciano was a revolutionary, a man who transformed American organized crime from a collection of street gangs into a national network of criminal enterprises. He did it not through superior violence, though he could be violent when necessary, but through superior organization. He understood something fundamental about power in America. It's not about being feared, it's about being essential. The political bosses of Tammany Hall weren't powerful because they were scary. They were powerful because ward captains needed their endorsement, because judges needed their support, because businesses needed their permits. Luciano made himself essential in the same way. The dock workers needed him to mediate labor disputes. The casino operators needed him to provide protection from competitors. The politicians needed him to deliver votes in Italian neighborhoods. The Navy needed him to secure the waterfront during wartime. He was too useful to destroy completely, too complicated to prosecute successfully, too smart to leave evidence behind. His only mistake was getting too comfortable, allowing Thomas Dewey to build a case using the testimony of frightened prostitutes and desperate madams who had nothing to lose. But even that conviction didn't break him. He served time, got deported, and continued operating from abroad. The system he created survived his imprisonment, survived his deportation, survived his death. That's the ultimate measure of his success. He built something that didn't need him to function, an organization so thoroughly decentralized that removing any single part, even the man at the top, didn't collapse the whole structure. There are still people in certain neighborhoods who speak of Luciano with a mixture of respect and nostalgia, as if he represented some lost golden age of organized crime, when bosses were smart instead of flashy, when the underworld had rules and structure instead of chaos. This is mostly mythology, of course. Luciano's era was just as violent, just as corrupt, just as destructive as any other period in mob history. But the mythology serves a purpose. It keeps his name alive, keeps his legend growing, keeps young criminals studying his methods and trying to replicate his success. Every time a mob boss tries to insulate himself from prosecution, every time a criminal organization uses shell companies and legitimate business fronts, every time someone structures a criminal enterprise to survive the arrest of its leadership, they're using techniques that Luciano pioneered. In the end, the secret trick was never just one trick. It was a comprehensive philosophy of criminal enterprise, a recognition that in a country built on paperwork and procedure, the man who controls the paper trail controls his own fate. Luciano understood that American law enforcement was powerful but procedural, aggressive but rule-bound. They needed evidence that would convince 12 citizens beyond a reasonable doubt. They needed witnesses who would testify credibly under cross-examination. They needed documentary proof that would survive appeals. If you made all of those things difficult enough, if you created enough layers and distance and deniability, you could operate almost indefinitely. Not forever. Nothing lasts forever, but long enough to build an empire, long enough to change the game, long enough to become a legend. The last photograph of Luciano, taken a few months before his death, shows an old man in an expensive suit, standing on a Naples balcony overlooking the Mediterranean. His face is lined and tired, his hair white, his eyes still sharp, but carrying the weight of 64 years of calculation and survival. He's not smiling. He rarely smiled in photographs. Instead, he has the look of a man who has seen everything, done everything, outlasted everyone. Behind him, invisible in the photograph but present in every line of his face, is the entire history of American organized crime in the 20th century. The violence, the corruption, the transformation of street gangs into corporate-style criminal enterprises. He stands there alone, the man who was never alone, the boss who insisted he was just a businessman, the ghost who made himself real enough to be deported but never real enough to be completely destroyed. In certain corners of the underworld, in the quiet conversations that happen in the back rooms of social clubs and the private booths of Italian restaurants, old men still tell stories about Lucky Luciano. They talk about the time he outwitted Dewey by being in the bathroom when Masseria was killed. They talk about how he turned his wartime cooperation into a get-out-of-jail card. They talk about the commission, the structure that made everyone equal but kept Luciano at the center of everything. Most of these stories are exaggerated, embellished, transformed by time, and retelling into something more than history and less than truth. But that's appropriate, because Luciano himself was always more myth than man, more carefully constructed image than authentic person. He spent his entire life making sure that nobody, not the cops, not the prosecutors, not even his closest associates, knew the complete truth about what he did and how he did it. The secret trick wasn't what he did. It was what he made everyone think he did, while the real operations happened somewhere else, run by someone else, documented by nobody.